Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the last segment of the day and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far, and for our final segment, we're going to go ahead and talk about Sunday Night Football yet again. Preview the game yesterday from a betting perspective. Now we get into the fantasy side of things for this one, and it's a bizarre one. Like I said yesterday, talking about this game, I feel like the Bengals and the Chargers are two very differently defined teams where the Chargers want to drag you into their game and the Bengals want to beat you into submission with their offense. And so it's going to be tough to gauge which strategy, which philosophy is going to win out in this one, but it's really tantalizing when it comes to talking about who to start and who to sit and fantasy advice for this one, because I look at the Bengals and say, okay, I have a pretty defined idea of who's excellent from a fantasy perspective and who's not, and who I might want to sit. But for the Chargers, all bets are off, because I feel like the best way to beat the Bengals is just outperform them on offense, which is what the Ravens have done for their two games, which teams have done. I think the closest kind of prototype of a game in which, a team won with a more complimentary performance is that game against the Chiefs, where the defense got them that crucial touchdown and Harrison Butker kicked that game-winning field goal. That was a more complimentary performance. But I don't think necessarily the Chargers are that well equipped to do what the Chiefs did. That's why it's such a bizarre kind of game for the Chargers in terms of analyzing their fantasy prospects in it. Because I want to have more hope and optimism about this offense, because this Bengals defense is very poor. But I don't necessarily know what direction Harbaugh is going to go with it, because do you stick with the Jim Harbaugh way and hope that you can retain the ball longer, thus keeping it out of Joe Burrow's hands and try and score as many points as possible? Or do you come out guns a-blazing with a guy who's capable of it in Justin Herbert and just hand him the keys to the car and hope he can win you the football game that way? I really don't know. I think the latter is the better way to go about it, even though I don't necessarily think the Chargers have the weapons to keep up with the Bengals. But I do think that it's a great game to kind of sink our teeth into here in terms of who to start and who to sit. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's start off with the easy part of it. The Bengals. Because obviously, we know that their defense is not appealing from a fantasy standpoint, but their offense certainly is. And we know the names of the players here. So it's easy to say that Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase are immediate starts. They are, in my opinion, the best QB wide receiver duo in the National Football League. They're playing MVP caliber ball, at least for Joe Burrow, and Jamar Chase is just doing his thing. A lot of worry was placed on this duo in the offseason because of all those contract talks about Jamar Chase's dissatisfaction with how they were transpiring. But now they look very focused and primed and ready to go to try and make it into the playoffs. Because remember, this is a very tough stretch for the Bengals when they have to pull up their schedule. But starting with the Chargers, this is a schedule that's going to tighten up a little bit. They still have a lot of divisional games to play. Actually, they do have an easier schedule, but they still have to play the Steelers twice. And if they don't win those games, then that's a huge detriment to their divisional hopes, because they've already lost 2 games against the Ravens, and the Steelers are going to be there and thereabouts at the end of the season. So you're going to want to at least split that series with them to try and win the tiebreaker and be the second team from the AFC North in the playoffs. So there's going to be some important games. Again, like I said, pretty balanced schedule the rest of the way for the Bengals, but you got to take care of business here, and I think they do it. And it starts with Burrow and Chase. In terms of who to sit, it is kind of bizarre to think about sitting anyone for the Bengals, but I think that it's time that T. Higgins is going to see a little bit of a decline. I feel like what I've seen from Burrow is that he has steadily been someone who knows his top 2 weapons. But this season has really evolved to distribute the wealth a little bit more. I feel like he's always been someone who's not necessarily excels too heavily in the vertical passing game. It's always been an underrated aspect of his game, and we know it's in his bag, and we know that connection with Jamar Chase can always happen. But I feel like he's going to pick you apart a lot more often this year than any other year of his career. He has different weapons underneath. You have guys like Hudson, Yoshavas, guys of that nature who can really frustrate a defense and elongate drives, sustain them, most importantly, get points on the board because you can't necessarily defend all their superstar weapons either. So that's the difficulty of determining who to sit week in, week out for the Bengals, because is Joe Burrow going to always have that explosive play in his repertoire in certain games, or is he going to pick this team apart? And I feel like for the Chargers, defensively, they feel like they can win certain matchups. So look for Joe Burrow at the start of this game to try and keep it short to intermediate in terms of his passing range, and then look for the explosive plays. That's why I feel like Higgins might suffer a little bit. He is the better route runner of the two, but I feel like when this game opens up, Joe Burrow is going to have a lot more opportunities to get Jamar Chase going than perhaps Higgins, because I feel like the Chargers want to take away as much of the middle of the field as possible. And so that's where you're going to see a lot of Joe Burrow's deep shots stem from. That clogged middle of the field where the Chargers want to account for all those secondary weapons so that they try and limit drives. But then that opens up the Burrow-Chase connection down the field. So that's why Burrow and Chase are my starts for this one for the Bengals, and Higgins might have to sit. And then, of course, in terms of a more easier benching option for the Bengals, the two running backs. I really don't see their purpose in this scheme. I feel like I want to say Chase Brown is the more late down, explosive playback, and Zach Moss kind of sets the tone in the early downs, but they're really not that defined. I feel like in terms of red zone threats and who could be more productive, Zach Moss potentially, because he's a better short yardage back. But I feel like in that two-back system, it's one of those where both are very frustrating because neither one can differentiate themselves from the other. So therefore, there's not as much balance as other two running back rooms in the National Football League. So that's why I feel like they're so puzzling from a fantasy perspective, and therefore very tough to gauge and most likely to be benched, because I really don't like them in this system and they don't necessarily work. On the Chargers side of things, however, I feel like you have to be very careful here, because Herbert, I feel like, I'm just going to out and say, could be a starter in this one, because any quarterback against the Bengals defense feel that they have an opportunity to put up huge numbers. But I feel like that little seed of doubt about whether or not Jim Harbaugh's going to allow him to has to be a big factor in that decision. That being said, I feel comfortable in knowing that Herbert is capable of doing it, and if he needs to, that's where his yardage production will come from. As Flashpoint says, I feel like a T. Higgins day is overdue. I feel like it's not necessarily gonna be his game here, because I feel like a lot of what the Bengals are gonna do is wait and pick and choose their moments to have those deep shots down the field, because I feel like that's what I said. The Chargers are going to want to take away the middle of the field, and thus T. Higgins, who I feel like is the better route runner of the two, kind of wants to work a little bit more underneath, is going to suffer a little bit, whereas I feel like the Burrow-Chase deep shots are going to open up a lot more because of what the Chargers might be focused on, rather than T. Higgins' opportunities. So that's why I feel like T. Higgins is going to be there. But in terms of the Chargers, I feel like it's safe to say that Herbert knows he's capable of doing what he needs to do to win football games, And if they're in that situation, perhaps, or down by a lot, expect Herbert to throw the football more often than he would in any different game. And then, in terms of who could benefit from that, I feel like Quentin Johnston could. Because Quentin Johnston is one of those guys who I don't necessarily feel like the Bengals can account for on the back end because of his verticality. He's really coming into his own. And I feel like if that's what you want to do, if Jim Harbaugh really lets loose in this one, then why not throw it to the guy who can get most vertical in Quentin Johnston? And it's no indictment of the other guys who I have sitting here, guys like Ladd McConkey and Josh Palmer, because they're very savvy players. They could have their opportunities here and there. But if you want big, explosive plays, solid fantasy production, and hope and optimism that the Chargers can play fast and loose in this one, Quentin Johnston's your guy. I feel like you have to be thinking about this from a tactical standpoint if you have Chargers players in your lineups. Do you really feel like the Chargers are going to be a team that's going to predicate themselves on passing the football and trying to match up with this Bengals offense mano a mano? Or are they going to be stuck in their ways? And I would like to think the former, because chances are the Chargers are going to fall behind early in this game. And they might have to play catch-up. So the best way to try and stay in this game from the start is to come out fast and loose. And so Herbert and Johnston are the two guys I'm looking at as potential starters to kind of help understand that sentiment. Let me know what you think in the comments about this game from a fantasy pinpoint. It's a very bizarre one. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back on Monday, as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you feel so inclined. Also, continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, I am out for the week. Thank you all.